Well, good morning, El Paso Bible Church. This is our Sunday school lesson for Sunday. I guess it's March 17th, and we're going to try to do this in one shot instead of 12 shots like it took last week. But if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open to Daniel chapter 8. We're going to continue on with Daniel's vision, and I remember that these are appendices, sort of. They occurred at a certain time frame in the chronology of Daniel, and he has a time stamp for them. But we have essentially covered, from the royal record standpoint anyway, Daniel's entire life of service in the kingdom of Babylon, and then in the Medo-Persian Empire from that perspective. And so now he's going back and filling in some details of some dreams and some visions that he received during that time. And so in Daniel chapter 8, in fact, I am way off here. Why am I open to Thessalonians? Thessalonians is a good book, but that's not where we are today. We're in Daniel chapter 8. And so it begins with a timestamp. And so we're thankful for this, for knowing exactly when Daniel is receiving these things. Now, you remember that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, who was in the succession got very messy after Nebuchadnezzar died. After he was restored from his humiliation, he ruled for a few years after that, and then the succession became really, really nutty. And Belshazzar ruled for 14 years or so. He died in 539, and this is the third year of his reign. And this is what chapter 8 says: "In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously." And so he understands that this vision takes place both chronologically in his own experience. It's subsequent, and it's also explanatory in that sense of being subsequent to the dream. It's filling in some gaps and giving some more information. And this is in the third year of Belshazzar's reign. It says in verse 2, "I looked in the vision, and while I was looking," this always sounds to me like those guys that says, "I was thinking to myself," and I said self, because that's what I say to myself, whatever. But this is the way they phrase it. "I looked in the vision." So he was in the vision, he was submitting to it. In a sense, he wasn't trying to get out of it, he was observing what was taking place. "And while I was looking in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam, and I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal." So I'm not sure if he's seeing himself in the third person or if he's locating himself with the geographic landmarks here. But this is about 200 miles away from Babylon. And he recognizes the location. We've understood that during some primary events in the book of Daniel that are recorded for us as part of the royal record of that kingdom, Daniel was not always present, and we believe that it was because of the nature of his position. He traveled the empire, traveled the kingdom, but he recognizes this. He's in Susa, and he is very specifically next to a canal, the Ulai Canal. Now, that may sound like some people I know, they don't like to read books like Moby Dick or the Master and Commander series, things like that, because of the detail, what some people refer to as the dry detail. And some records are written that way, and some people treat the Bible that way, as if it's full of details that are really insignificant. And that's not really true. It's just that the context of the significance is not always immediately apparent. So in this case, Daniel is taking from this, where, this is not like one of those near-death experiences. Almost universally, I saw a bright light and I was approaching it, and it's an unidentifiable location, and we have no idea. There's all sorts of reasons why you might see bright light while you are unconscious. But Daniel is not seeing just a bright light. He's not seeing just the presence of something. He's not flying through space. He's not in another dimension. He's within the kingdom that he is currently serving in the role as a government official. So he knows where he is. And they indicate how we're to take these visions. Now, there are some figurative elements, but they do not take place in a figurative location. They apply to real places, tangible locations. And the vision is taking place within an earthly kingdom, orders, marks, recognizable things. And Daniel has the time stamp, at least the chronology, right? And Daniel has seen timestamps. He knows from multiple dreams that Babylon, despite every time we see somebody greet a ruler of Babylon, what do they say? "Oh, king, live forever." Let me tell you, if the kings are all living forever, the kingdom doesn't die. These kings die and this kingdom ends. And Daniel knows that. So he knows that's not going to happen. He knows it's not an interminable kingdom. He knows that it's not supplanting the kingdom that was promised to his people, the people of Israel. But he understands that this is relevant to those kingdoms and the chronologies that are taking place. So he sees this. Then I lifted my eyes and I looked. So he was observing the canal. I don't know if it's an interesting place, whatever. But he lifted his eyes and he looked. And behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. Now you may not understand a ram, I think there's even a ram beanie baby. Like you can go to a toy store and they have stuffed rams that you can have your child play with. I think that may be kind of foolish, because then if the child comes up to a ram, he may not know how to treat the ram. Most rams are sheep, of course, and we have the idea of sheep being fluffy little animals that are even-tempered and nice. They're not. Most sheep will bite you with enough provocation. Rams are dangerous. You don't turn your back on most rams. Very, very rare instances in which you might be comfortable around that animal, but especially when they are in what we would call rut and other animals, ungulates like a sheep, they're dangerous. And so they may not be the most intimidating of animals, but they are intimidating in their own right, and they have a function within the flock, and they are equipped to do that. But he sees a ram, a mature male sheep with 2 long horns, except in this case, they're not symmetrical. So most of the time, a healthy animal with good genes or whatever has symmetrical horns. But these are both long, but he says one is longer than the other. And so we understand that there is a symbolism taking place here. One takes precedence over the other. And he says the longer one is coming up last. So they're part of a unified whole. They're not on separate heads, but one is longer than the other, and one seems to be set back from the other and has arisen last. Now, that's actually, if we're talking about an actual animal here, that's a deformation. This animal is a coal, because we don't want to pass on those genetics. It's indicative of some other problems that are potentially going to arise. But in this case, one takes precedence over the other. The first one is long and in the proper position. The other one is longer and comes in behind the other. This is somewhat reminiscent of the imagery that we have, and in fact, it clarifies later in the chapter that this is referring to that kingdom. This is reminiscent of the bear in Daniel's previous vision. One side of that bear, remember, it was laying outside, and one side was higher than the other. It was a unified whole, but one portion was more prominent than the other. And the more prominent one comes up last. Now, we know historically, and we also know from later in this chapter, the interpreter says this is the Medo-Persian Empire, but we know from examination that certainly the Mede portion of the empire was the primary and the initial version, or initial portion of the kingdom, but the Persians overtook them in prominence and power within this bipart kingdom. And so the ram is here. And I told you that rams are aggressive. They're dangerous. This happens. It doesn't matter what it is. You don't want to be in a pen alone with a small, any size of mammal, actually male animal, unaltered. Whether this is a ram sheep or a buck goat or a boar pig or a bull calf. You don't want to be isolated with most of them in this case. And this ram is aggressive. So in verse 4, I saw the ram butting westward, northward, southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. Does that sound like an animal you want to make a beanie baby out of? You want to put in the crib with your kids? I don't think so. He's aggressive, and no one could rescue him from the wrath of the ram. But he did as he pleased, and he strengthened or magnified himself. I saw the ram, but he's butting in all directions. He's exerting his aggressiveness in all locations, right, relative to his own. And as I said, we have all sorts of depictions of ram. Most people underrepresent their aggressiveness. However, no matter how aggressive a ram is, you don't think of it as being something from which you can't rescue somebody, right? They have teeth, but they don't have fangs. They have They have hooves, but they don't have paws. They have horns, but I mean, it's not quite like an elk or something where they're pointy and sharp. And certainly a lion should be able to fix any ram's wagon, no matter how aggressive the ram is. But nobody can do this. Nobody can rescue anyone from this ram. He does as he pleases. He becomes strong, and no other beast could stand before him. Meaning, whether there's a lion around or not, the lion's got nothing on this ram. No predator of any stripe is a match for this ram somehow. Now, that means something to me, that this is a matter of divine appointment, that this ram is unable to be resisted, unable to be put down. It's a selection to a particular purpose, and we've seen in Daniel that Daniel himself and other rulers give that credibility to that process. That particularly in relation to Israel as the chosen people of Yahweh, his chosen representatives on the earth with a chosen function, that all of these nations play a part in achieving his purpose with them. So, to continue, Daniel says this, he was still looking, he's still observing. Behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. In fact, he's moving very fast. He doesn't have to touch the ground. He's moving quickly. The goat, he says, had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He's a unicorn goat. Now, that's an interesting element. But he came up with a ram that had the two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. He comes up to the ram. He's a goat with one horn. That kind of a unicorn representation there. And this does happen. This is a genetic deformation. It normally accompanies some other deformed elements to the animal. They're not normally mighty or strong, and they die soon. But they do develop a horn right in the middle of their head like that. But he doesn't have a normal symmetrical horn. He's more of a unicorn. And he comes up to the ram and he furiously overpowers him. He exerts all of his wrath onto this ram and he breaks the two horns on the ram. So I'm come beside the ram and he's enraged at him and he struck the ram and shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Now, if I saw a ram and a goat wrestling, I would have a hard time picking the winner. They're generally fairly comparable in size and aggressiveness and equipment for fighting. And as I mentioned, both of these, actually, a ram with significantly asymmetrical horns set wonky on their head, and a goat with one horn right between his eyes would normally be cull animals. They would be among those who were first consumed in most herds. Their rise to prominence in this vision of future events cannot be credited to anything other than God's purpose being executed in relation to his elect people. And I've used that term specifically because there's a very large portion of the uses of the purpose of the word elect in Scripture that people ignore the context for. When we're talking about an elect nation, we are not talking about a nation in whom all the people are going to heaven when they die. We're talking about people who are chosen as a people, as a nation, to achieve a certain purpose on the earth. It has nothing to do with the individuals in that nation being justified or not. Whether they are going to heaven when they die, is how we would say it now. By grace through faith, it was always and ever about their responsibility as a nation, and they were chosen to do it. There was blessings assigned to pursuing that purpose, and there was discipline assigned to rejecting that purpose. But when we talk about election, the vast majority of those references are not relative at all to the individual, biblically speaking, but rather to a nation or a people. And all of the nations that are recorded here in these are in some sense an elect nation, but Israel is elect among the elect. God has chosen these lesser elect nations to achieve his elect purpose for his elect people who bear his name, the nation of Israel. But at all times, all times, all times, every individual is able to be justified by grace through faith alone in God's promise. All times. No exceptions. Whether the nation is under discipline or the nation was experiencing abundance in the land. But the record says this of Daniel's vision: there was none to rescue the ram from the goat. All this makes sense, of course, because there was no one to rescue anybody from the ram to begin with, and the goat is stronger than the ram. So there's no one that can overpower the goat. Well, the goat gets very, very strong. That's what this says. That's what Daniel sees. The goat magnified himself. Like, he's not just looking big, but he is actually magnifying. He's getting bigger, exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken. Now, I have a buck goat, and this buck goat has broken his horns on more occasions than I can really probably describe to you. Never in a fight, and this, you'll notice that this male goat doesn't break his horn in a fight. The horn breaks simply because it breaks in the dream. And there are now 4 conspicuous horns that grow out toward the winds of heaven. Saying they have a geographical representation. And this would not be, there is a physical representation here. When a goat's horn breaks, it normally doesn't break and then not grow. It just grows back in a weird, broken, yucky way, what we call a scur. And there's really nothing to do about it but to manage it and try to keep it from growing into their eyeballs and weird stuff like that. But I think it's important. This male goat is not overcome by another kingdom directly. The horn is broken. The power, the rule of the ruler is broken by something else, and that's important for the historicity of the prophecy. However, let's continue, because we're not going to actually get to the interpreter's interpretation of this today, but we do need to finish the content of the dream today. And it says, out of one of them, verse 9 of Daniel chapter 8, out of one of them came forth a small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land, or just beautiful. I think that's what the exiles referred to the promised land as, having been away from it for so long. Now, don't get the chronology confused, because this isn't, of course, the first little horn that we've seen. We saw Daniel's first vision of 4 beasts, and out of the 4th beast, there arise 10 horns, and then a little horn with a big mouth that defeats 3 of the 10 horns that come out. A different chronology, right? So that's the 4th beast. Those events are chronologically related to the demise of that 4th kingdom. And this is not. The horns resemble rulers within the kingdoms. That symbolism stands firm throughout these dreams, but it is not the same. This is directly pertaining to the 3rd kingdom. And so if I were doing this in person and we were in the sanctuary with a whiteboard, I could draw you some parallels, but I'm going to try to do that verbally. And certainly we'll add these notes to other platforms that are available so you can see the comparison. But this is directly pertaining to the 3rd kingdom, which is the bronze part of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Remember, we talked about that last time, that Nebuchadnezzar viewed the kingdoms in terms of glory, and in which he was the golden head. He was the most glorious of all the kingdoms in that chronology, and they descended in glory from them. And Daniel saw a parallel which said that as the kingdoms reduce and diminish in glory, they increase in violence and aggressiveness. But they are parallel kingdoms in between those dreams. In Daniel's first dream, the parallel was the leopard with 4 heads, or the leopard-like creature. Actually, it doesn't say he was a leopard, but a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads in Daniel's first dream. And so we have the parallel between the horn that now breaks up, and breaks up into 4 lesser horns. They grow out in different directions. So this is a small horn relative to the 3rd kingdom, this one. And it is subsequent to the 4 little horns that grow up. That's how this happens. They are coming out of the ashes, so to speak, of that kingdom, in a sense, the demise of that kingdom. He says it grew up towards the beautiful land. And as I said, I think that's what the exiles would have referred to it, reminisced as to its nature. And it says he grows up to the host of heaven. Verse 10, it grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. Now, you know that there could be a couple different references to the host of heaven in Scripture, and some of them are referring to an angelic experience, an angelic context. I don't think that's the case here, because in this very chapter, it talks about the holy place and where the sacrifices are taking place, that kind of a thing. But he's growing up to the host of heaven. In other words, he's moving towards them. He magnifies himself, and he causes some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth. Now, in this dream, in a few verses, Daniel refers to those people as the people who are worshiping at the altar, which tells me that it's referring to people of the nation of Israel that are this host. It trampled them down. It says, and even magnified itself to be equal with the prince or the commander of the host. And it removed the regular sacrifice from him. So this is the guy. What we're saying here is that this little horn is coming up, and the prince of the host, the commander of the host, is the one that is receiving the sacrifices. So this is a member of the Godhead. And this little horn makes himself out equal to be equal with the commander of the host, and just stops the sacrifices. And the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. Now, this is significant, of course, and we'll talk about why it's significant. But verse 12 says this, and on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice. In other words, it is because of this rebellion of the host. This is another time of rebellion. This is another time in which the nation has failed to be obedient to their mandate. That on account of the transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. In other words, he will supplant the worship of this prince of the host or commander of the host in the absence of his sacrifices, and there will no longer be a holy place that is functional. Now, he magnified himself, made himself strong, and it says the host will be given over to him. Now this is unique, you have to remember, because at this point in Daniel's lifetime, there is no temple, and the people are not in the land. The temple was destroyed roughly 50 years, I'm not sure exactly, but 50 years, more or less, 586 BC, between the 40 and 50 year mark prior, by Nebuchadnezzar, and everybody was hauled out of the land. And so they were no longer there, they were no longer worshiping in the sanctuary, and so for Daniel to see this requires some changes. And he knows that this isn't in his lifetime. He's going to hear that again, but he knows that he shouldn't expect to see all of these events and all of these transitions already based on the timestamps that he's already seen in this dream and others. But there's no temple at this point in Daniel's life. And certainly for there to be a temple, no one else is going to rebuild the temple. No one else is going to do that. Other than the people of Israel. So there's two things that Daniel is witnessing that are encouraging in a sense, and that is that the people will be back in the land and the temple will be rebuilt and functional at that time. Yet, in that same chronology, though the people will be back in the land, the temple will be functional, the altar and the holy places will be restored. They will, but instead of being preserved, they will be cast down and trampled again and desecrated again. And the people will be ruled over by a counterfeit one who deceives them. Now remember the chronology. We're not talking about things that are future for us. We're talking about the third kingdom. We're talking about Greece here, based on what we'll get to that. There's some very particular descriptions of what's going on. And what to expect in the future from Daniel's perspective. But this demonstrates that this pattern is cyclical in the life of the nation. That God actually meant it when he said that if you are disobedient to me, your experience will not be peace, abundance, and prosperity. It will be discipline. And it happens over and over and over again. for the purpose of restoration to their purpose in the world as God's elect nation, for that purpose to be a priestly nation among the nations. Still his purpose, by the way. It's still his plan, still his purpose, still his objective with Israel. He's not done with them. And we are thankful that we can look at this scripture, that we can examine it and see more about that purpose. So that's going to do us for today. This lesson was a little bit shorter, but I did not feel that we ought to go ahead and jump into the interpretation on top of this lesson and try to whack it out in another 10 minutes. So next lesson will probably be a little bit longer because we'll have to review this and connect the dots. So I hope you join us, and we'll see you next time.